So now as we look at corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. It's quite a mouthful. So we have corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, where we'll later shorten up to be Cpctc. Now it's a nice acronym to shorten, but you need to make sure you know what it's standing for. And what it's saying is if I have two triangles that are congruent, where I've done all of this work to now show that two triangles are congruent, and maybe it's by side, 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 or side, angle, side, one of our methods, what this now says is that all the parts are congruent. So if we have that these two shapes are congruent, we now know all the other parts. So let's say if we know that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. That means angle A is congruent to angle D, angle B is congruent to angle E, angle C is congruent to angle F, side AB is congruent to DE, side BC is congruent to EF, side AC is congruent to DF. Now maybe we already used some of these in getting to our congruence, or our triangle congruence, but now that we have this, everything now qualifies. And we'll see that in some of the proofs. And it's going to look as a slightly different proof as we go through. For overlapping triangles, our best advice is to separate the triangles, then relabel congruent parts as well as reflexive sides and angles if they apply. So an example to that would be if I had this diagram. I'm likely going to split it so I have this triangle and this triangle. So it splits to be that, where the overlapping side was that bottom side. And we know that's the bottom. We know it's congruent because it was a reflexive side. For angles, maybe we'll see something like these two triangles where they have that shared angle. We will split them and draw them again with their shared part. So just things to look at as we go through these proofs. Start with, we just have a diagram. We need to figure out, is AE congruent to BD? So not a formal proof, but we're just going to talk our way through and see where we're at. So I have A and B congruent, those angles here, and then D and E. If I look, those angles make up two sets of triangles, and those are the triangles we're going to use. So that's DAB and EBA. So these are the overlapping triangles with one of them right here and then the other right here. Now we could do like this left and right side triangles, or maybe triangles that are up on the top, but these are important because they give us values we can work with. So what do I know from this? Well, I also know that AB is congruent to itself. That's going to be by reflexive property. And once I have that, I can say that triangle DAB is congruent to triangle EBA by angle, angle, side. Now once I have those congruent, I can say that AE is congruent to BD because corresponding parts these two of congruent triangles, these two are congruent. Now that's the informal way of the proofs that we're going to be looking at. So we come down to the bottom left. I have some givens here, which we'll label. And I've already written them here. Now I want to show that AB is congruent to CB. In order to show those are congruent, I have to find that the two triangles are congruent, and that's going to be ABD and CBD. Now, if in order for those to be congruent, I have to find the other part to get to the congruence. So if I look, BD is the reflexive side, so that is congruent to itself. So we'll say BD is congruent to BD, and that is reflexive property. Then from there, how are the two triangles congruent? Well, I have two sets of angles and a side. The side is not between the two, so that'll be angle, angle, side congruence. Now that we have congruent triangles, we're going to say the parts are congruent because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Next one, we have CN is congruent to WN. Angle C is congruent to angle W, both given. Now, I want RN and ON. RN and ON are these two sides here. They are not on triangle CRO and WOR. They're on the kind of the left side, right-sided triangles that I'm looking at. So I'm going to write those here just to give me something to work with. So that's CNR is congruent to WNO. Now the reason those are going to be congruent is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. I wrote too many letters there. So what we have to figure out is what's the middle steps that get us triangle congruence, what type of triangle congruence it is, and then we have the rest of the proof filled in. So let's label what else I know. So I have C, angle W were congruent, and then CN, WN were congruent. Well, at angle N, I have vertical angles, so let's put those in there. That'll be angle CNR is congruent to angle WNO, and that's because vertical angles are congruent. And now we need to name our congruence for the two triangles, and it appears two angles and a side. That's going to be angle, side, angle. Once we have that, we can then say that RN is congruent to ON because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Next page. I've kind of written the givens already. Let's fill those in. And let's go up to the first one. So I need to figure out which triangles I'm using first. So I have S and I are congruent. I'm just going to put dots because I got a small diagram there. S and I. I have G and A. And then I have T as the midpoint of SI. It should be SI there. Now if T is the midpoint, then that gives us those parts. So it's looking like if I redrew my triangles, I want the triangle GST because then I have this congruence. Let's label some points a little better. Then if I went with the other one, kind of the flipped version of ITA, I also have the same type of parts. So that's what we're going to work with. So I have a midpoint. Midpoint's telling me that IT is congruent to TS, and that is the definition of a midpoint. Next, I need to have, I already have my angles identified. I think I can go triangle congruence. So we're going to show triangle GTS. So that went one dot, no dot, double dot. So I'll go ATI. And this is going to be angle, two angles and a side. The side is not between the angles, so angle, angle, side. And then SG is congruent to IA, which is this side and this side, and that's because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Next one, we have MN is congruent to MA, and ME is congruent to MR. Now I'm going to split these up, so let's draw them separately here. We got EMA and NMR. It's going to be a little easier to see once we label. We had our congruent sides here and congruent sides there. Now, kind of planning it out, I need to get something else. I don't know about EA and NR. What I do know is this angle right here was in both of them, this angle M. So this angle is going to be congruent to itself in both triangles. I don't have to technically name with 3 letters because it's the single angle in both. So we're going to say angle M is congruent to angle M by reflexive property. Now we can identify our 2 triangles as congruent. So that would be, let's go EMA is congruent to. So EMA went down the double line, single line. So we'll do RMN. And that will be by side, angle, side. And then we know that angle E is congruent to angle R because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Last one, we have BT is congruent to EU, and BU is congruent to ET. So what that means, let's look here. BU and ET, we know those are congruent. We know we have vertical angles. We want angle B and angle E, but this BT and EU is a problem because that spans both triangles. So what if we drew a side right here? So now we could make 2 triangles, go B, U, T, and U, T, E. We have BU and UE congruent. We have BU and ET congruent. We need, let's get the markings to match. We need something else. Well, that vertical angles didn't show up here, but what if I go UT is congruent to UT? So that would work. UT is congruent to UT, and that is reflexive property. From there, I have 2 congruent triangles, so we'll go triangle BUT is congruent to, let's see, we went 1 and 3, so ETU. That would be by side, side, side. And then last, angle B and angle E, which are now corresponding angles here. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent.